thank you. Thank everyone for coming out tonight. Is there anyone who's made all 5 of the lectures? All right. Yeah, very good. Well, then I think on this auspicious evening, I can thank you for your service, for coming out 5 straight Wednesdays. We really appreciate it. I have a few people to thank before I introduce our speaker. The first is the Arizona Daily Star, Bobby Joel Buell and Mark Henshin. I really appreciate your support of our series. From TMC, Mary Atkinson, Director of Wellness, and Julia Strange, VP for Community Benefit. We'll hear from them, from Julia shortly. And Melissa Vito from the UA Office of Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, and all the Magellan Circle members who are in the audience. You really put the weight of the money behind this series, and we really appreciate it. We have also a number of lecture sponsors and supporting sponsors, including AZPM, and I'd like to thank Jack Gibson and John Booth for their support in ensuring that this event can be streamed. We're in the well into the triple digits of people who are watching simultaneously from other venues dispersed all over the region and further. Arizona Humanities and also the Downtown Tucson Partnership, Michael Keith, Mike Clark from Pima Council on Aging, and the Fox Theater. And I'm really appreciative of the work of all the staff and the director, Craig Sumberg. And we also have a number of community sponsors that I'd like to thank tonight, including Casa de la Luz, Downtown Kitchen, Maynard's Marketing Kitchen, Power Women Investing, and Roscob Camborian Financial Advisors. And tonight, a special thank you to Patricia Schwabe from Pinka for her support of tonight's lecture. And it's a great pleasure of mine now to introduce Julia Strange, who will come up and say a few words on behalf of Tucson Medical Center. Julia has quite possibly the best title in the entire city of Tucson, Vice President for Community Benefit. I mean, and since you're with TMC, I think that usually means that the first thing to have community benefit is to do no harm. Yes? Absolutely. But she handles strategic communication, government relations, and most importantly for tonight's event, community outreach as part of a holistic approach to community health that involves programming such as tonight and a number of community partners. And Julia, thank you so much for the support of the 3rd year now as a title sponsor. We really appreciate it. Well, please.
Thank you. So we started being happy, and then we ate food, and this year we're immortal. So that's pretty cool. Tucson Medical Center is a nonprofit community hospital. We're independently owned, and we have really strived to make smart decisions, collaborating with our community to ensure that we are sustainable for many years. That's how we talk in business terms. In the terms of this lecture series, we believe that the steps we've taken have helped TMC be immortal in this community. When I thought about what I would say about immortality, which I know nothing about, I thought back to when our founding fathers were starting this country. The average age of an individual was about 49. Now the average age is about 80. If you think back, they would have thought we were immortal. We've managed to contain things that used to kill us, like smallpox and other illnesses like that. We recover from heart attacks. We fix collapsed lungs. We do all kinds of amazing things. I don't do any of them, but there are nurses and doctors and other clinicians that do those wonderful things. And my gift to all of you is that I don't do any of that. I just write about it. When you see the advances in medicine, it's both technical advances and just that compassionate caring that brings that to the community so that we can be healthier. We've made many advances, and now we're focused increasingly on prevention. So these illnesses that we once sought to treat, we now want to prevent. And so that's what we're here for tonight. Through history, there's been a belief that human intervention can prolong lives, to the allure of eternal youth and immortality. And if anyone is the key to immortality, it's those nurses, it's those doctors, it's those caregivers that help us on our journey. TMC is proud to be part of Tucson. We're proud to be a community hospital here to serve, and we are proud to sponsor events and series like this. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And now it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Shaun Nichols, a professor of philosophy and cognitive science at the University of Arizona. Shaun received his undergraduate degree from Stanford University and his PhD from a very fine Department of Philosophy at Rutgers University, and he taught for many years at the College of Charleston before moving to our excellent Department of Philosophy in 2006. And he's written 3 books, all published by Oxford University Press, and over 100 articles on topics dealing with morality, the self, identity, consciousness, memory, really all the things that I struggle with on a daily basis. He is also one of the founders and a leading figure in a subfield of philosophy known as experimental philosophy. And this is a field that is really only about a decade old. And Shaun published some of the founding works in this area. And it's distinguished by its focus on empirical research, on taking social surveys and doing experiments with real people to tap into their psychology and intuition in order to understand what philosophers aim to understand, but have traditionally done so through analytic introspection, and that is, of course, the key issues that make us human. I said he works on real people, and you'll hear some empirical work today in that area. Of course, that means that he's not allowed to study other philosophers, but nonetheless, I think that you will find this particular talk very interesting, and also, if you were here last week, different from the kind of philosophy that Rachna Kamtekar talked about in her work. He has written extensively on death and immortality, and also even on reincarnation, and was a co-PI in a major grant through the Templeton Foundation called the Immortality Project. And this year, his work on Alzheimer's and identity was picked up by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Scientific American and HuffPost and Fox News. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shaun Nichols.
Many philosophical views that are revolutionary seem to have really bleak implications. So there's no such thing as free will. You don't really know anything about the external world. The mind is just the brain. But one revolutionary philosophical view is supposed to promise something positive, even therapeutic. And the basic idea is that the quest for immortality rests on a kind of confusion. It rests on a mistake. The fear of mortality is based on a misguided view about the nature of the self. And that's an idea that suggests a way of correcting our fear of mortality. It's based on a mistake, and if we can come to appreciate this mistake, then it should alleviate our fear of death. We have this sort of common sense idea that what the self is, what I am, is the same thing from childhood through old age. And then the question of mortality is, do I survive after biological death? But many scientists and philosophers think that this is just a mistake. There is no self that stays the same from childhood through old age. There's no pearl-like thing that is identical across time. Instead, what we are is a collection of traits. And those traits, things like what you value, what you think, what you remember, what you prefer, those traits change across time, and so you change across time in a very literal way. Now, there are extreme versions of this view which maintain that there's no such thing as a self whatsoever, that there is no self. But there are less extreme views that just say, well, what the self is this collection of traits, and those traits change across time. As they change, you change. You become a different person as the traits change across time. And this is the view that's advocated in a really important book by the British philosopher Derek Parfit. And he says, once you see that there is no pearl-like self that stays the same across time and appreciate that what the self is a set of traits, then you realize that the self changes as you go throughout the lifespan. And I want to say a word about why this is actually a very plausible view. So some of my traits have stayed the same since childhood. So for instance, I still love my parents who happen to be here tonight. Hi, Mom and Dad. But many of my other traits have changed so dramatically. My religious views, my aesthetic preferences, my political views. When I was in college, I thought that it was just, there was obvious that the only viable political solution was Marxism. I've backed away from that somewhat. So these kinds of traits change as you go through life, and the view of these philosophers and scientists is that means that you literally change. That means there is a real difference in you across time. So Derek Parfit, in this book where he defends the view that what you are is a set of traits, once you realize that you're a set of traits, he says, it changes the way you should think about yourself. He says, this happened to me. He says, before he realized that the self is just a set of traits, he said, my life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, at the end of which was darkness. And then he says, when I changed my view, when I came to think that the self wasn't this thing that stays the same across the lifespan, but instead just a set of values and convictions and memories, when I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There's still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but the difference is less. Other people are closer. I'm less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. And so he's saying, once he came to appreciate that the self is ever-changing, it's a set of traits that's changing throughout the lifespan, it had this dramatic effect on his attitude about how to treat other people, how to think about other people, and how to think about his own death. Now, you might wonder, though, whether Parfit is perfectly representative of the human species. You might think that he isn't. So several years ago, a few philosophers and I started looking at the psychological underpinnings of how people think about philosophical issues. And this came to be known, as JP mentioned, this came to be known as experimental philosophy, which might sound like an oxymoron, but that has not deterred us. We continue to do this kind of work. And what I'll be talking about tonight is applying this method to questions about whether philosophy can actually help you, whether learning philosophical views or coming to have certain philosophical views can change your attitudes about important issues like generosity, fairness, punishment, and fear of death. So one of the standard views in philosophy is that when you come to think, if you come to think that the self is a set of traits, it should have a series of effects on how you think about other people, how you think about yourself, and how you treat other people. So one thing is, if you think you change across the lifespan so that you're not literally the same person from one year to the next, then you should be more generous to other people, at least when you think about money that you'll have in the future. Because, and I'll go through this in a little more detail, but the idea is that if I think that I'm going to be a different person in the future, then I should have less concern for the money that that person will have in the future and relatively more concern for other people who need money. The second issue is questions about responsibility. If I think I'm less the same person now than I was a year ago, then it seems like I'm less responsible for the bad things I did a year ago. And then finally, if I'm less the same person 10 years from now that I am now, then I should be less afraid of death, because that person who will die in 10 years is not really the same as me. He will be significantly different than I am. So we've looked at these issues. That wasn't one of the jokes. We've looked at these issues in a variety of ways. We've looked at each of these issues, and I'm going to tell you about a little bit about the first two, and then we'll focus mostly on the last one. So in this first set of studies, which I did with a person in a business school at Columbia, Dan Bartels, and a psychology grad student here, Trevor Kavarin, and we wanted to see whether changing people's attitudes about the self, their beliefs about the self, would change how they gave to charity. So we had two groups of subjects. Sometimes they were students, sometimes they were community populations. And one group we led to think that the self was very stable, that it stays the same across time. And the other group we led to think that the self changes a great deal across time. So in the first condition, where they were led to think the self is stable, we told them, recent research suggests that personal identity is far more stable than most people realize, and then the characteristics that make you the person you are, your personality, temperament, major likes and dislikes, beliefs, values, ambitions, life goals, and ideals, these are established early in life and fixed by the end of adolescence. And then we say, so the person you are now will be very much the same as the person you'll be in the years to come. Then the other group, we told exactly the opposite. We told them the self changes like crazy. It turns out, or we told them the research suggests that the self changes like crazy. And we didn't have to lie to them to do this, because social science is so underdeveloped that there's tons of evidence on both sides. So we just focused on one bit of evidence for one group and the other for the other group. So one group was told the self really stays the same, and the other group was told recent research suggests that the self is far more changing than you ever would have thought. The characteristics that make you the person you are now are likely to change radically even over the course of a few months. So the person you are now will be very different from the person in a year, 2 years, or so on. Now, we gave these different conditions, so one group was told the self is stable, another group was told the self changes a lot, and then we just asked them all, to what extent do you think you'll be the same person in a year? And these manipulations make a difference. They actually change people's beliefs, at least in the short term. The people who were told this, the research suggests that the self changes very little, thought the self was stable, and the other group thought the self changed a lot. And then after they did this, we said, oh, by the way, because you participated in our study, you get a bonus. The bonus is, we're going to give you $6, and you get to decide how to divide that $6 between yourself and a charity. And the charity we used was Save the Children. We did pilot work on Save the Elderly, but nobody wants to give to Save to the Elderly. So we went back to Save the Children. So half of them were told that they'd get the $6 in a week. Half of them were told they'd get the $6 in a week, and half of them were told that they'd get the $6 in a year. And our idea was that if you get the $6 in a week, it shouldn't really make any difference whether you think the self changes a lot or not, because you're not going to think the self changes very much in a week. So we predicted that there'd be no difference in how much money they gave to Save the Children if we gave them the $6, if they were told they'd get the $6 in a week. And in fact, it's exactly what we found. There was no difference at all between those conditions. But we were interested in what happens if you think the self changes when you get the money in a year. So we tell them, you will get $6. And of course, we really gave them $6 when the year came up. But we said, you'll get $6, but it won't come for a year. You have to decide now how much money to give to Save the Children. And so the people who were led to think that the self stayed the same, the stable self group, wanted to give about $4 to the charity in a year. And so our prediction was that we thought that if people think the self changes a lot, then they'll think, well, in a year, that won't be as much me, and so I'm less concerned about that guy getting the money and relatively more concerned about Save the Children getting the money. And that's exactly what we found. We found that, or rather I should say, this is where we were hoping to responses to show up, and that's exactly what we found. About 25% more money they gave, which is a pretty significant chunk in the world of charitable giving. So changing the way they think about the self changed how much money they gave to a charity. And when these results came in, I was thrilled. I was so happy that we got them. But then I immediately worried, well, we told them all this stuff about the self. We asked them about the self. Maybe that changed the way they were thinking. So we ran the experiment in the opposite direction just to sort of confirm it. So in the opposite direction, they came into the lab, and we just told them about Save the Children and said, you're going to get $6 either in a week or a year. And then they made their decision about how much money to give to Save the Children. And then we said, oh, by the way, to what extent do you think you'll be the same person in a year? And what we found was that people who thought that they would change a lot in a year gave significantly more money, again, just like this, when they thought, when they were going to get the money in a year. If they thought the self changed a lot, just as a matter of their personal views, they personally came into the lab thinking the self changed a lot, they will give more money when the money comes in a year, suggesting that their philosophical views about the self does have an impact on the amount of money they'll give to a charity. So we were excited by this result, and we wanted to look at the next item. And for this, this work was done with a brilliant graduate student in philosophy here, Hannah Tierney, and we wanted to see whether we could change people's attitudes about responsibility and punishment by this kind of manipulation again. So once again, half of them were told the self changes very little, very stable. The self is the same across time. Half were told the self changes a lot. And then they were told, imagine you cheated on an exam. And the question was, how much punishment do you think you deserve now? And they were either told that they cheated on the exam a week ago or a year ago. And our prediction was, well, if they cheated on the exam a week ago, they should think they deserve the same amount of punishment regardless of whether they think the self changes a lot, because the self will not have changed very much in the course of a week. And that's exactly what we found. There was no difference between the conditions when they thought that they had cheated a week ago. If they thought the self changed a lot versus didn't change at all, made no difference whatsoever. What we were really interested in was, what if you cheated last year? And people thought that if I cheated last year on an exam, then if I think the self stays very much the same, then I deserve about that severity level of punishment. And our prediction was, well, if they think the self changes a lot, then in a year they should think that wasn't as much me a year ago when I cheated on that exam, and so I don't deserve as much punishment. So we were hoping for results down here, and again, that's exactly what we got. People were significantly less punitive when they thought the self changed a lot, when they're thinking about something that happened a year ago. So we're very excited about these results, and we moved on to the last issue, fear of death. We wanted to show that the manipulation, or see if the manipulation would change people's fear of death. So once again, half of the subjects were told the self stays the same across time, exactly the same across time. Half were told the self changes like crazy, much more than you would have anticipated. And then we said, imagine that you'll die in a week. That was one condition. The other condition, they were told, imagine you'll die in 10 years. And then when you imagine dying, to what extent are you disturbed by the following aspects of death? And the one we were really interested in was the basic existential worry, never thinking or experiencing again. And what we predicted was that if you think the self changes a lot versus a little, it isn't going to affect death anxiety in a week at all. If you're going to die in a week, if you think you're going to die in a week, it doesn't matter whether you think your self is going to change. You're going to have the same amount of anxiety, and that's exactly what we found. Then we thought, well, if you think that you're going to change a lot, then when you imagine dying in 10 years, you should have significantly reduced fear of death, because that's really not going to be very much you in 10 years. So when we led people to think that the self stayed the same, that's the amount of anxiety that they reported about death. And so our prediction was that when it comes to the changing self condition, they'd be significantly less fearful, a lot less anxiety. So we were expecting results up here, and what we found was it made no difference whatsoever. And we tried this every way imaginable. We tried 1 year, 5 year, 10 year. We tried to change the wording. We tried different scales. I mean, if we'd gotten a result, I would have made sure that we could replicate it. But my God, we tried everything we could think of. We could not budge it. We could not get people to show any reduced fear of death by these kinds of manipulations. So then we thought, well, what about something else that isn't quite as dramatic as death? What about future pain? So we gave subjects a task in which, again, Half of them were told the self doesn't change at all, and half were told the self changes a lot. And then they were told, imagine you have to get a root canal in a week versus a year. To what extent would you be anxious about the root canal right now? And our prediction was, well, you shouldn't matter at all if it's a week, whether you think the self changes or is stable. But if it's a year, you shouldn't be as worried about that guy in a year is going to get the root canal. That's not that much you. You shouldn't be so worried about that guy's pain. Here you're right to laugh because, boy, were we wrong. It made no difference whatsoever. It does make a difference if it's a year away. You can say, oh, yeah, I'm going to get the root canal in a year. But changing how you think about the self makes no difference to the extent to which you'll be anxious about pain in the future. So we have these two very different patterns of results. For generosity and punishment, we find that if you make people think the self changes, it really affects their behavior. It actually affects their monetary decisions, and it affects their legal decisions in other experiments. So what people think about the self and whether they think the self changes really has a significant impact on their thoughts and attitudes and decisions. However, when we ask about death and we ask about pain, it makes no difference whatsoever. It doesn't track anything. We don't get any movement by telling people the self changes. Why is there this disparity? Why is it that telling people the self changes affects some things and not others? And we're starting to think that it has something to do with the way people represent the self, the way people think about the self, and in particular, the way self plays a role in memory. And so I need to go through a brief detour to explain this. We do often think of the self in terms of traits. You know, I think of myself in terms of my love for indie rock and mountain biking and drinking. So I think of myself in terms of those traits, and that's an important way that I think of myself, and I identify myself that way. And this is apparent that people think of themselves in terms of their traits from research on long-term memory. In research on long-term memory, people distinguish between two kinds of memory. One kind of memory is based on facts. So it can be things like the first president of the United States, where Tucson is in Arizona, but also things like where I was born, who my parents are, what the year was that I was born. All of these things would be contained in factual memory. Very different kind of memory, though, is memory for experiences. So I remember the experience last night of having dinner with my parents at a particular restaurant at a particular time. I remember that experience. I remember that I was there for that experience. And that's a very different kind of memory. And in recent work over the last 20 years or so, people have looked at how these different kinds of memories play a role in how people represent the self. And so in one particularly sad case, this brain damage patient, KC, who just recently died, was in a motorcycle accident at the age of 30. This was 30 years ago. And after the motorcycle accident, he lost all of his memories of experiences. He had no memory of experience whatsoever. So when he was asked, you know, what do you remember about your childhood? What do you remember about school? What do you remember about your parents? Do you remember something happening? He said, it's a blank. I don't remember a thing happening. And he also couldn't think about things in the future. If they said, imagine going to another place. What do you think would be fun? He said, it's just a blank. I can't do that. What was striking is that he had very good factual memory. He knew what was going on, who had been president when he got in the motorcycle accident. He'd been an engineer as a professional, and he remembered facts about what an engineer did and where the plant was that he worked and where he lived. So he had all of this knowledge of facts. What was striking was that even though he had no memory of experiences, he knew what he was like. He knew his characteristics. So he went through a list of adjectives of traits like generous, shy, cranky, and he identified which of those he thought characterized him, and his mother did the same. And they matched. What he thought he was like was what his mother thought he was like. And so he had some kind of knowledge of his traits, of what his self was represented as traits in this kind of fact-based memory. Indeed, he even knew what he was like after the motorcycle accident. He'd updated his knowledge of what his traits were. Now, remembering past experiences is a very different kind of thing, remembering that I did a particular thing or having a particular kind of experience. And so one feature of this kind of memory is it seems like it happened to me. Or I think about the future and I think, that is going to happen to me. And so one question is, what if you find a brain damage patient who has a sort of abrupt break in their traits? To what extent does that affect how they think about their self in terms of their experiences? And so if you have changes in your traits, abrupt changes such that all of a sudden you have very different traits, how does that affect your memory of your experiences and yourself in your experiences? And there's one particularly harrowing case, this novelist from the Northwest, Floyd Skloot, who happens to be the father of Rebecca Skloot, who wrote the book on Henrietta Lacks. But Floyd Skloot had got a virus that caused severe brain damage, and he wrote this haunting memoir about what it was like to live with brain damage. And he starts his book by saying how much brain damage changed who he was, changed his self. So he says, it changes not just how we see or speak, what we know or recall, who we are is no longer the same. Without warning, without choice, we are other. And so he has changed an enormous amount because of the brain damage, and he knows he's changed a lot. But then when he gets into writing his memoirs, he talks about his childhood like this. He was obsessed with baseball cards when he was a kid. And he says, I remember teasing Dodgers catcher Roy Campanella about the way he wore his hat and secretly smashed and folded my own hat until the crown resembled Campy's. I asked Pirates pitcher Paul LePalm if his teammates ever called him Paul. I liked to sniff the cards, which held the scent of bubblegum from their packaging. He goes on like this for pages, never suggesting that, oh, and I was a very different person then. He's identifying himself with that childhood individual, even though he knows he's changed dramatically. And that's a particularly striking case. It's a particularly striking case because it's brain damage. But you can think about these cases even in your own life. So if you think about some important event from your past, like let's say your first kiss. Now, but those kids are really young. I was in my 30s. But when I think about my first kiss, I know my traits have changed dramatically since then, but it doesn't get in the way at all of the sense that I was the one that a girl finally was willing to kiss. Like that's a salient fact and gives me some feeling of self-worth. So that is a really important feature of the memory, that it was me that happened to, even though I know that I've changed dramatically in the intervening years. And this suggests that when it comes to memory, we represent ourself in terms of traits in one sense, but we represent ourselves in experience in a very different way. When we think about our experiences, and I think about my memories of things that happened in my childhood, I think of myself as exactly the same person, even though at some level I know I've changed dramatically. So now, when we return to thinking about the experiments, we had the experiments on generosity, charitable giving, and the experiments on punishment. It turns out people actually pay attention to trait change when they're thinking about those things. They're thinking about the self, at least partly, in terms of the traits that they have. But when you ask people to imagine dying, they're not thinking about their traits at all. They're just thinking about this future experience where they're going to be there and then they're going to die. And that just seems terrifying. There's no way to blunt that by saying, oh, by the way, you probably won't like the same bands as much. That doesn't seem to have any kind of effect. So now we have at least some kind of idea of maybe why we're getting these disparate effects in these different studies. And so now we'll go back to death. So I presented these results, basically everything I just said, to a workshop of a Buddhist workshop some years ago. And a friend of mine there was in the audience, and he said, of course this didn't work. You did this on Westerners. Nobody actually thinks the self changes that much in the West. You have to go to people who really believe that the self changes or that there's no self. You really need to look at those kinds of people. My friend is not the Dalai Lama. My friend is the guy on the left. And so he said, you need to look at people who actually believe that the self changes. And there is an obvious population. The population is Buddhists. So Buddhists explicitly are supposed to hold, this is what the philosophy says, that there's no self. And there are a variety of components to this. I'm not a Buddhist scholar, I just work with one. But so the idea that there's no self, part of it is that things are impermanent, things are constantly changing, nothing is the same across time. That's one element of the Buddhist belief. But then there is this explicit claim that the self is just an ephemeral thing. It doesn't exist from one moment to the next. It's just a bunch of little momentary events that overlap. So there really isn't a self at all. There certainly isn't a self that continues across time. So the idea that there's a self that continues across time, according to Buddhists, is just a mistake. It's an illusion. People talk about the self and they say, it's okay if you talk about the self as long as you realize that it's just conventional talk. It doesn't actually get at the deep truth, because the deep truth is there isn't a self that stays the same across time. The last element that I want to mention about Buddhist philosophy is that they maintain that there is no reincarnation, which makes sense. If there's no self, then how could there be a self that is reincarnated into the next body? However, they maintain a belief in rebirth, which they describe in terms of metaphors. They say, well, it's not the same self. It's like one candle lighting another candle, and then that lights another candle. There's nothing that's exactly the same across those times. It's just this causal sequence. I have to say, when I was first told about that, I thought that they obviously believe in reincarnation, and that's just bull. Like they don't actually believe that. Now, I say that now because I had my comeuppance with the data, as we'll see that I was probably wrong about that. So how do we proceed? We wanted to look at a variety of different cultural groups. So one group were Abrahamics in the US. They were almost entirely Christian. There were a few non-Christians who were, there were a couple of Muslims, but it was mostly Christians. The second group, the one that we were particularly interested in, were Tibetans, and these were lamas that were in the monasteries in southern India. And then the final group that we were interested in were Orthodox Hindus in the Varanasi region of central India. And the way we did the work is we went to India and we had several research assistants from each group. So we had Tibetan students that we trained how to do the research, and then they went to southern India to the monasteries, and they did the experiments with people in the monasteries in the south. And we trained Hindu students to go to Orthodox Hindus in the Varanasi region and give them the experiment there. And this gave us lots of time to eat street food and contract tons of parasites. Okay, so our first question was, do Buddhists actually say that there is no self? Or is that just something that we think in our Western academic philosophy? We think, oh, this is what Buddhists are supposed to say. We wanted to see whether Buddhists actually held these kinds of views. So we did this in a variety of ways. I'll tell you about a couple of them. One was we just asked the extent to which they thought they had stable characteristics. So this is a lot like one of the items I had before, but think about the important characteristics that make you the person you are, like your personality, your convictions, your aspirations, and then indicate the extent to which you think you'll be the same in the future or not. 0 is I'll be completely different in the future, and 100 is I'll be exactly the same in the future. So what did we find? Well, for the Christians, they tended to think they'd be very much the same in the future. For the Hindus, they thought they'd be pretty much the same in the future. What about the Tibetan lamas? Not at all. Not going to be the same at all in the future. And this is, these are, I don't know how many psychology talks you go to, but you don't see graphs like this very often in psychology, where one group says absolutely and the other group says absolutely not. So another question we asked was, do you agree with this, that there is some core self that stays the same across time, exactly the same throughout your life? And we found that the Christians and the Hindus, again, overwhelmingly said, yes, there is some stable self that stays exactly the same across life. What about the lamas? Absolutely not. Almost everyone said no, completely no, furthest end of the scale. Then another question we were interested in was, one of the key issues is when you think about death, Buddhists say you should try to cope with it by thinking that the self doesn't exist. It's a mistake to think that there's a self that stays the same. And so we wanted to see whether they thought about coping with death in this way. So we we gave people a number of options. We said, the following things reassure me that death shouldn't be feared. And we had a bunch of choices, and they could just select any that they wanted to, as many as they wanted to. But we were really only interested in this one. There's no self that stays the same across time anyway, so it doesn't make sense to fear death. What did we find? Well, here we start with the lamas. The lamas, almost everyone said, absolutely, I think of that when I'm trying to cope with death. The Hindus said it to a surprisingly high extent as well. What about the Christians? They said, what the hell are you talking about? Like, there's no self that stays the same across time. It doesn't have any kind of uptake for them. So there's this dramatic difference in how they think about the self. Now, we wanted to do some things that were a little less sort of direct, some things that were a little more to the side to see whether they would make these same kinds of judgments that seem very different from Western judgments. So we asked them about specific preferences that they had. So they would indicate, what's your favorite kind of music? What's your favorite kind of food? What's your favorite kind of trip or something like that? And then they were asked, was that the same or different 10 years ago? And what you find in the West is people tend to think that their traits, as they get older, they tend to be pretty much the same. They get increasingly more set in their traits. And you see this in the left bars, whereas the Tibetan lamas continue to think that those things change. They thought their music preferences changed, their food preferences changed, their travel preferences changed. They really think of themselves as changing on their traits across time. And then one last experiment we did to try to see the extent to which this idea of no self and impermanence is really insinuated into their way of thinking. We did an experiment that was initially designed for work with young children. So this is work on what's called psychological essentialism. So if you tell kids and adults, this is done with adults too, you say, see this horse there on the left? Some really clever cosmetic surgeons got a hold of this horse, and they shaved its fur and put on different kind of hair, and they put antlers on its head, and they changed its nose a little bit, and they changed its feet. And then they say, after they're done with that, do you think it's still a horse, or do you think that it's a deer? And even 7-year-old kids will say, you just made a horse dressed up like a deer. It's still a horse. You just change what it looks like. Whereas if you show them a necktie and you say, oh, these really smart doctors got this necktie and they clipped it into pieces so that now it looks like shoelaces. Do you think it's still a tie, or do you think now it's shoelaces? The kids will say, well, obviously now it's shoelaces. So they say, it's still a horse that looks like a deer, but now that thing that was a tie before, it's really shoelaces. So we just gave this kind of an experiment to the three groups we were looking at, the Christians, the Hindus, and the Tibetan lamas. We find that there's a very strong, predictable, this is what we expected, effect such that they thought that the animals were still the same thing, but not the artifacts. And we find that in the lamas, there is a difference, but it's much, much smaller. They see much less difference between whether something is still a horse and whether something is still a tie, which suggests that their ideas that the world really doesn't have essences that stay exactly the same is pretty deeply built into the way they think about the world. So this Buddhist idea that the self is constantly changing, there really isn't a self that stays the same across time, that does seem to be present in these people that we've been looking at in southern India, these teachers in the monasteries in southern India. But now what we really wanted to do was see how this affected their attitudes about death. So we know that this population we're looking at will say there's no self that stays the same across time. They'll say, I use the idea of thinking about the fact that no self stays the same to cope with death. How do they actually deal with death? Well, we had two different kinds of experiments that we did, and I'm going to tell you about how they're both set up, and then I'll tell you the results for each of them together. So one, we just gave them a scale for fear of death. And there are lots of scales. We picked one of the more reputable ones and one of the popular ones. It has many items on it. It has 31 items on it. But there was one part of it, one subcomponent in particular that we were interested in. And it's the fear of death of self, basically. It's called the fear of self-annihilation. And so there are 5 items on this, and here are 2 representative ones. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because of the loss and destruction of the self. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because of the destruction of personality. So these are representative of the kinds of items that you have in this. And so, as you'll see, our prediction is that the Tibetan lamas should have less fear of this because they don't believe that the self exists across time anyway. Our second task was very different. It was a task that involved imagining a certain scenario, and the scenario is the following. Imagine you have some terminal disease, and you will die in 6 months. But there's a pill that will allow you to extend your life for another 6 months. However, there's only one of these pills, and it turns out there's somebody else who's very much like you, but this person has the same condition, and there's only one pill, and this person will die, but we indicate various possibilities for how long the pill would extend that person's life. So you get to decide at each point, would I rather have the pill if I live 6 months, or should I give it to him if he will live 1 month or less? You might think, well, there, it's obvious. I should keep the pill. It doesn't make any sense. But as you go down, you might think, well, if it's I get to live 6 months or he gets to live 5 years, maybe at that point you think, you know, this guy's a lot like me. I should let him have the pill because he'll have so much more life than I will if he takes the pill. So at each point you make a decision. Will I take the pill or give the pill to him under that scenario? And our prediction was that the Tibetans would have less fear of self-annihilation because they don't think the self stays there is a self that stays the same, and that they would be more generous with these few months of their lives. They'd be more willing to say, well, it's just 6 months of this particular life, which is changing anyway, whereas this other person would get 5 years. So what did we find? The first thing we did is we wanted to see what Buddhist scholars would say the right answer is. So we asked, our research base was in Sarnath, which is just outside of Varanasi, the Central University of Tibetan Studies, which was set up by the Dalai Lama. It's the foremost place for Tibetan Buddhist research. And we had the monks there, some of the senior scholars, go through the scale and indicate how much fear they thought was appropriate for self-annihilation. How much fear was appropriate when you thought about the fact that death would mean that the self would no longer exist. And this scale, you're going to see a lot of these, so let me be clear. Lower is more fear, higher is less fear. So they basically thought you should have no fear of self-annihilation. You shouldn't have any fear of self-annihilation because it's a mistake to think that there's a self that stays the same anyway. So what did we find? Well, let's start with the Abrahamics. We found that the Abrahamics had not a lot of fear of self-annihilation, some fear of self-annihilation. The Hindus had almost the same amount. And so now our prediction is, because these guys were actually pretty low on fear, our prediction was that the lamas would be way up here, just like the monks at Kutch said they should be, just like the monks at the Central University of Tibetan Studies said they should be. So our prediction is it will be up here. What do we find? They had significantly more fear of personal death, significantly more fear of self-annihilation. When I first got these results, I wrote to the guy in India who we'd been working with, and I said, you reverse the scale. Clearly you put strongly agree and strongly disagree on the wrong sides, because there's no way, this makes no sense. And he said, no, the scale is right. I don't know what happened. I don't know why they're making these responses. And we had 2 different experiments running and got exactly the same thing, where they reported much higher fear of death. So I was despondent about this, and I was meeting with a colleague, and he said, well, maybe what's going on is that the Tibetans just have much, much more fear of death across the board. We have this huge scale of 31 items. Maybe they have much higher fear of death overall, and then their fear of self-annihilation would be relatively less than their fear of the rest of death. And I was so excited by this, I jumped up and ran home from the bar and got to my spreadsheet, opened up my statistics package, and looked at this. So let me just give you a sense of something about the rest of the scale. So here are some of the other items. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because of missing future events, because I'll be forgotten, of the sorrow to relatives and friends, or of the unknown associated with it. And so these are just some of the examples, but there are a lot of them, and you can see how people score on these. And what we found, these are the scores of the Christians and the Hindus on the rest of the scale. That's how much fear they rate on this scale. And so what we're hoping here is that the lamas will be actually terrified of the rest of death. So they'll be extremely low here, so that their relative, their performance or their judgment about the self-annihilation, which is up here, will look significantly less fearful. So our hope is that they'll be right down here. What did we find? No difference at all. Like, it was exactly the same number as the Hindus. So they have a distinctive fear of self-annihilation. And so you can even look at this way. You see that on the rest of the scale, they're like everybody else. But when they think about the death of self, they have this distinctive fear. So we thought, well, maybe it's because they don't believe in the afterlife. Maybe it's because these lamas don't believe in the afterlife. So we looked at, of course, we had an afterlife scale in our experiment. And these are the extent to which the Christians believed in an afterlife and the Hindus believed in an afterlife on this scale. And so what about the lamas? They believed in an afterlife just as much as the Christians. So it didn't look like it's that. And then the final thing we did is we thought, well, we actually got all this data from Christians, but while we were collecting it, we just so happened to get a lot of data from atheists who didn't believe in an afterlife. So we wanted to look at that group. So what about the fear of self-annihilation in Western atheists who don't believe in an afterlife? They have significantly less fear of self-annihilation than the Tibetan lamas. Even the atheists who don't believe in an afterlife are not as afraid of self-annihilation as the lamas. So this is shocking to us. We really were puzzled by this and are still puzzled by it to some extent. But let me tell you about the other study now, before I tell you about our current guesses. So in the life generosity study, remember, you get to decide at what point you will say, if at any point you will say, I will give the pill to the other person because they're going to live so much longer than I would live. So at what point would you be willing to sacrifice your 6 months for another person having a longer life? And the Abrahamics came in at about 3 to 4 years. The Christians were at about 3 to 4 years. They'd say, I would give the pill over. And the Hindus said basically the same. So our prediction is that the lamas will be way down here. They will think, I should give that up really early, at 1 year or something like that. Instead, they're significantly higher than the Christians and the Hindus. They are significantly more, well, let's put it this way. They're significantly less generous with these months than are the Christians and the Hindus. In fact, over 70% of them said, I wouldn't give that pill under any condition, even if they're going to get more than 5 years. Whereas only a minority of the Christians and the Hindus said that. So we were, baffled by this, really not what we wanted at all. We really were hoping to find effects that suggest that Buddhism would be therapeutic, as I said at the beginning of the talk, that it would help us cope with death, and that's not what we found at all. So it seems like there's this paradoxical effect of Buddhist teaching. It's supposed to make us less fearful of death, and yet, in our study, we're finding that it makes people more fearful of death. It's supposed to make us more generous, and yet, at least when it comes to sacrificing part of your own life, it made the lamas less generous. Now, why is this? Well, I think that part of it is that I was deeply mistaken to think that they don't believe in rebirth, because I think that the lamas actually think that at biological death, that is it. That's the end. There's no more. There's no reincarnation. You don't get to go into another body after that with your same self. That really is the end. At the same time, though, this sense that I'm the same person across the biological lifespan, that's something that I think is extremely hard to get rid of. That's something that's hard to extirpate. So when you think about your first kiss, the idea that that was you, that really was you that had that first kiss, that's something that's very hard to get rid of. And the lamas don't seem to be able to get rid of that. So it seems like they have the idea that I don't survive past biological death, but they don't give up the idea very easily that I don't survive during my biological life, that I am the same person across that biological lifespan. We can look at work within the tradition to see some kind of support for this suggestion. So in the Tibetan literary tradition, there's something called the autobiography. There's a Tibetan autobiography. And these are supposed to be okay to have these autobiographies, because what you're really doing is you're not saying there is a self, you're just talking about the self in a conventional way, not a real embracing full metaphysical sense of self. But when you read the autobiographies, it's really powerful. Some of these passages make it seem like they really are thinking of themselves as continuing across the lifespan. And so in the most celebrated of these autobiographies, which is called The Life of Milarepa, who's thought to be one of the great enlightened figures in Tibetan Buddhism, at one point in his book, he's reminiscing on, he's been away from his home for years because he was training to be a monk. And he goes back to his ancestral home and goes into his house. And he finds their bones on the ground. And he says, when I realized they were the bones of my mother, I was so overcome with grief that I could hardly stand it. I could not think, I could not speak, and an overwhelming sense of longing and sadness swept over me. Now, this does not sound like a man who's saying, well, there was a person 20 years ago who had this experience when he walked into a house that was the house that his mom had. This is a person reporting a deep emotion that he feels now when he's thinking about this experience. And this is the kind of thing that I think is so hard to get rid of. It's a kind of sense that I'm the same person across time that's very hard to uproot. And it seems like that's the kind of problem, that's the thing that the lamas have been unable to do, and why they still have this significant fear of death of self. Still, you might wonder, why do they have more fear of death of self than even the atheists? What is going on with that? And we now think there might be a very different kind of explanation for that. So one of the features of Tibetan Buddhism, most Buddhist traditions, is you're encouraged to think about death a lot. So here's one reported exchange between Buddha and some of his students. On one occasion, the Buddha asked several of the monks, how often do you contemplate death? And one of them said, Lord, I contemplate it every day. And Buddha says, that's not good enough. And he asked another, and he said, I contemplate it with each mouthful of food I take. And the Buddha says, better but not good enough. What about you? And the last one says, I contemplate death with each inhalation and each exhalation. And the Buddha doesn't comment on that, so I guess that's good enough. But you might think that maybe the way to cope with death is not to think about it all the time. It might be that that's not the best way to deal with it. That it might well be that philosophically, the Buddhist view that there's no self, the self doesn't exist as a continuing thing across time. That may well be a philosophically rational reason not to fear death. But our deep sense that we're the same person across our lifespan is something that we find very hard to uproot, we find very hard to displace. And so it might be that instead of thinking about death every day, you might just think about something else, like, I don't know, biking in Tucson Mountain Park, or seeing a rock show at Club Congress, or donating to charity, or having a drink. Thanks.